We'll start. Great. It's just like a couple of seconds for our attendance.
I can't see the attendees, Qaid. Is there a problem?
No, I can see that the number is increasing now.
Oh, really? I can't. Yeah. Sorry.
No worries. Cool. Great. Welcome, everyone, to our third webinar of Kvinna and Oxfam co-organized webinar series, The Road to COP27, Advancing Gender Equality Through Climate Action, where we will focus and we will invite experts from around the globe to explore the gender climate conflicts nexus. And in today's webinar, we will focus on understanding the climate gender conflict nexus. And we host remarkable speakers from Oxfam, the Women's International League for Freedom and Peace, and from Heinrich-Böll-Stiftung and academia to introduce the intersections between conflict, peace, security, climate, and gender. This is our third webinar, and we will introduce entry points for integrated actions to respond to gender dimensions of climate security risks and its proposed feminist solutions for sustainable peace and environmental justice. We will also shed the light on the challenges faced of women in Palestine who are vulnerable to climate change, which is compounded by the Israeli occupation and its policies limiting the community's ability to adapt to climate change. My name is Samah Ilos, and I am thrilled to be your guide for this fabulous set of speakers and these conversations we're going to have today. I want to share with you that the main language of this webinar will be English. We're going to have simultaneous interpretation from English to Arabic and vice versa will be provided during the webinar. Just click on the below option to activate the interpretation. اللغة اللي رح نستخدمها اليوم بالويبينار هي اللغة الإنجليزية، بس حيكون عندنا ترجمة متزامنة مع حديث ضيوفنا الموجودين اليوم معنا خلال الويبينار. بإمكانكم تفعلوا الترجمة بالنقر على اوبشن أو خيار الترجمة الموجود في أسفل الشاشة. As a note, today's web event and webinar will going to be recorded, and the whole series are going to be uploaded to our Kvinna YouTube channel after we're done with the whole webinars. And please interact with us in our Twitter account and follow us and Kvinna Mina. Let's start. So the MENA region is the home to delicate and conflict-affected contexts. In such contexts, combined with the scarcity of natural resources, the provision of essential services, such as water, it's critical to mitigating the burden of climate change, instability, and conflict. The MENA region is projected to experience increasing temperatures, water stress, and instance of extreme weather events, with direct consequences for regional food and water security. Although women are rarely responsible for conflicts of climate change, they are the first to experience its impacts through displacement, occupation, food insecurity, and others. Peace building and sustaining peace are increasingly difficult in MENA because climate change directly affects the dynamics of ongoing conflicts and increases the likelihood of conflicts. Climate change contributes to migration and conflict and acts as a threat multiplier to human security in the region. Climate security and climate justice should be high on the international community's agenda, in the civil and government's agendas as well, as these are human security and social justice issues. However, understanding the linkages between climate, social justice, and human security among governments and civil society remains poor in the MENA region. Women are the least responsible, yet they are the most affected by the climate change. Therefore, it's critical to support and expand women's agency and right to find solutions and participate in decision-making processes, especially in peace and climate decision-making processes. Peace building efforts should become climate sensitive, linking climate adaptation to human security, and peace building will increase the women's resilience to climate risks. Understanding the nexus between gender, climate, and conflict is also critical for developing successful policies to fight climate change and resolve conflict, and women must meaningfully participate in shaping these strategies. We're fortunate today to have many experts here with us in this webinar to help us understand this connection and explore potential feminist solutions from different perspectives. So let's get started. And we are starting with the perfect guide to kick off this conversation. Our first speaker is going to speak in English, and she is Simone van Sluten. She is a policy advisor, gender and conflict at Oxfam Novid. She works in advising the women, peace and security agenda in the Netherlands and globally. She's also passionate about refugee rights. Previously, she worked at the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, and Simone will introduce to us today the intersections between conflict, peace, security, climate change, and how all of these do they interact with each other. So welcome, Simone, and the mic is yours.
Thank you so much for that great introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's really my pleasure to participate in this webinar and in this series with other wonderful speakers on the panel. So I'm very excited, and I'll just get started. So I'm going to introduce the topic as was just explained. And so starting with conflict and climate. So the effects of climate change, they're felt everywhere, but communities in fragile and conflict affected countries, they have to carry the double burden of the climate crisis and conflict. And actually more than half of the states in the world that are most vulnerable to the climate crisis are affected by conflict. For example, this includes Yemen as one of the most vulnerable countries, but also other countries in the MENA region on this list. And while it's generally agreed that climate change, it's not a cause of conflict, we can consider it a threat multiplier because climate change impacts, they undermine peace and security because they exacerbate pre-existing and long-standing social, political, economic, environmental factors and tensions that may exist in communities. And already fragile and insecure contexts are particularly vulnerable to climate conflict risks, as well as forced displacement, natural resource-based conflict, and general heightened insecurity. In turn, having a conflict or having conflict part of the country and the community, as well as poverty or weak institutions, makes it harder for communities to cope with climate effects and kind of anticipate the problems that may occur. So one type of conflict that I want to highlight is natural resource-based conflict, because it's increasingly prominent, and especially in the MENA region, it's very important. Firstly, factors like extreme weather events, more frequent drought, general unpredictability of rainfall, all impact the quantity and the quality of natural resources. And secondly, many of the existing conflicts that climate change will exacerbate already revolve around natural resources or the institutions that deal with them. So this is a very relevant issue, especially as was also mentioned in the introduction, in the MENA region, there are fragile and conflict-affected contexts, and the provision of essential services in combination with natural resources, it's really essential to tackling all these challenges and to ensuring, the health and security of the community. And while women are generally not the ones who cause climate change or causing conflict, they are the first ones to be impacted by it. So this kind of brings me to the gender dimension of this climate, conflict, and gender nexus, because gender, it's a cross-cutting lens that bridges climate change and conflict. Women are often on the front lines of climate change, and they're most exposed to its threats. However, at the same time, they are often excluded from conflict mediation processes, peace building efforts, management of natural resources, all of these decision-making spaces that they are uniquely positioned to contribute to, because they have all the knowledge and the experiences, and their participation also makes for more inclusive policies. But sadly, we see that due to social norms or other barriers, they're often excluded. So it's clear that the climate conflict link creates gendered effects. For example, in rural areas of developing countries, women often rely on natural resources to sustain their income and their family. And despite the fact that they are collecting these resources, they often lack ownership and rights over, for example, land, property, and other assets. And this puts them at a disadvantage in times of crisis and conflict, because they have less legal standing, they have less leverage that they can use in their situation. Furthermore, women's dependence on natural resources make them vulnerable to a change in the availability of these resources. So as an example, if there are water shortages and women and girls have to walk farther to collect water, this increases a burden on their time, their health, and their safety, because there's more of a risk of gender-based violence during the longer journeys that they have to make. And the impact of climate change can be worsened more when you intersect gender with other elements like race, class, ethnicity, socioeconomic standing. So this will all have a different impact on the women in question. Another example of gender dynamics shifting as a result of conflict and/or climate is a pattern of men migrating to urban areas in some countries. This increases the share of female-headed households. Now, this can be an opportunity because there can be more, economic or social independence. It opens up different avenues that weren't there yet, but it can also create more struggles because maybe the woman in question had access to land through a male relative that has left, or they will have less respect from the community. So it can go both ways, and it's important to understand the different dynamics that are part of it. And it's important to emphasize that women are not just victims of conflict or climate threats. They have a lot of agency, they have a lot of unique knowledge and experiences that make them really well positioned to, be active in the discussions and to think about solutions. But the marginalization from these processes creates a big problem. So it's important to not only think about the victim side of it, but also really the opportunities and the agency. It was already mentioned a bit in the beginning that, of course, displacement is a really important topic, and it's often a result of conflict and increasingly of climate change and climate phenomena. And women are often worst hit by this displacement. And the practical impact is that women who are displaced face a greater risk of gender-based violence. They lack access to relief resources, access to healthcare, education. Refugee girls are half as likely to be in school as refugee boys. And this, of course, impacts their opportunities during the lifetime. So it's a key moment. And the adaptive options of displaced women can also be limited due to social norms, not too many livelihood opportunities, lack of legal rights or ownership rights over land, over property that I mentioned earlier. And as a result, if women lack these resources and kind of the freedom that they provide, they might get trapped in areas where disaster and climate risks are very high. So this is, even if they are not displaced, it's also a big risk for them. And then turning to the issue of militarization and weaponization of resources, this is quite a relevant topic as well, because in the MENA region, there's a high military spending, while conflicts have also become more protracted over the years. So this is not something that's going to stop very quickly. And as a consequence, there is less space in the government budgets to spend money on social objectives like education or healthcare or initiatives to cope with the climate crisis and prepare the country and the population for that. And this really shows the hard security approach that really focuses, on the military side, and this kind of more conservative side thought about security as opposed to the human security approach, which really considers different factors that make a population feel safe and healthy and contribute to their well-being. And usually women are disproportionately harmed by this because they are often relying a lot on social spending as well, or they can benefit from it a lot. And climate change has made the weaponization of conflict quite effective in MENA. And an example of this is in Syria, where a lot of the water infrastructure and other critical infrastructure has been destroyed as a result of the war. And stakeholders in the conflict also use water and restrict water as a weapon to kind of control, to further their objectives and control parts of the population. So a lot of the population doesn't have access to clean or easy access to potable drinking water. And this, so it's both a weapon of conflict and it's a future source of conflict because there is scarcity of water, and this can cause conflict between communities. So it's kind of this vicious cycle that's very hard to get out of. And then turning to kind of the understanding of this gender, conflict, and climate nexus at the international level. So unfortunately, the gender-specific impacts are still poorly understood at the international level. In 2000, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, which was the start of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and different resolutions followed. And a lot of progress has been made in including gender into peace and security thinking and processes, but linking it to climate change is still underdeveloped at this time. And it took 7 more resolutions and 15 years to make a reference to climate change in one of the Women, Peace and Security resolutions. So it shows that it's quite a slow process, while it's actually such an urgent issue. And some countries have made national action plans to kind of carry out and implement their commitments on women, peace and security, which is a very good tool, but only 17 out of 80 plans address this connection between gender, conflict, and climate, and only 3 of them have specific objectives. So we see that it's kind of coming into the thinking of different states, but it's not really showing any promises in their practice. And what's also lacking in many of these plans is explicit promises and plans to increase women's participation and their influence in these decisions, in these discussions, which also causes the plans not to be as inclusive and as effective in the long run. So perhaps I will just end by emphasizing again that over focusing too much on women's vulnerability can obscure their leadership qualities, their unique position to come up with solutions, and their important perspectives to be as inclusive as possible. And it's really crucial to break down these barriers to their influence and their participation if we want to understand this issue in the best way and come up with the best solutions, because it is so urgent. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope that provided an informative background. I know we can talk about this issue for hours and hours, so it has to be quite limited, but I'm happy to answer any questions after the other speakers. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Simone. That was very rich, informative background regarding the intersection between climate change and different conflicts, peace and security in the MENA region. And you were very as well specific about how it's built into it, focusing not only in the symptoms of the conflict and the issues, but also digging deep on analyzing the causes of what is happening today and how it will affect women in general. And I found it very interesting regarding the militarization, because people miss this link and miss this understanding of knowing like why does it matter and how does it affect, but just like analyzing the causes of how that governments have less space on coping up with climate change by focusing in other dimensions or in other priorities. Thank you so much for sharing. And I want as well to invite our participants to share their feedback, their questions and answers using the question and answer option, and as well state to whom they are directing their questions, because at the end of this webinar, we're going to have time to share questions and answers. Thank you so much, Simone. And our next speaker is Kvinna, who will speak about feminist solutions from sustainable peace and environmental justice. Catherine is the environment focal point at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She is supporting the inclusion of environmental justice perspectives into the work of WILF's program, coordinates national sections, work on environment, and oversees advocacy on the links between peace, environment, and feminist perspectives with relevant collective processes. Previously, she also worked in the WILF's disarmament program, where she supported the organization's mentoring, advocacy, and research on a wide range of disarmament programs and issues. Prior to that, she worked at the WILF's Human Rights Program. Catherine has an honor bachelor on liberal arts degree from the University College of Maastricht and master degree in human rights from the University College of London. Catherine, very happy to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Sama, and thank you very much also for inviting WILFs to speak in this really cool webinar series and to be among such great speakers and organizations. So I would like to bring in a bit of a root cause analysis on the links between gender conflict and both the climate crisis and the broader ecological crisis. And before I start, I just wanted to share a note on terminology. So I prefer to use the term ecological crisis instead of climate crisis because it's not really only the climate that is rapidly deteriorating and that has direct links to conflict and gender. It's also so many other aspects that are extremely worrying, including loss of biodiversity, deforestation, ocean acidification, soil degradation, air pollution. And all of these issues are really closely linked to the climate crisis, but I feel that they sometimes tend to be forgotten when we only refer to climate crisis or climate change. And I know these webinars are taking place in the context of COP, which focuses only on climate change, but I think it's important to take a holistic view on this. So in the first part, I would speak about the interconnected root causes of links between climate and conflict from a feminist perspective. And both Simone and Sama already mentioned militarization, and that's what I will be focusing mostly on. And then in the second part of my contribution, I will sketch out some of the entry points in addressing these challenges. So what are the root causes of the crises that we find ourselves in? I was able to listen to some of the other webinars, and I think much of it has already been, addressed in terms of what are the structures that have caused the climate crisis. But I just wanted to repeat the systems of oppression that have led to both the destruction of the planet and violence against people, including armed conflict. And that is capitalism, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, and militarism. And what I want to focus on today is militarism as a system of oppression and destruction, and is a system that significantly contributes to the ecological crisis. And it is interdependent and reinforced by all of these other systems that I just mentioned. So what is militarism? And maybe some of you already are familiar with this concept, but I will just go back to basics for a moment. So militarization is a process by which something becomes controlled by, dependent on, or derives value from the military or militaristic criteria. And it's a process that places the military and weapons as something that is good, something that is needed, and something that's indispensable. And it's also a process which implies that the use of collective violence is the best way to solve social problems. But we can also find militarization in ordinary daily culture, in video games and pop culture, music, films, etc. So militarism is underpinned by the assumption that the use of force or the threat thereof is the most appropriate response to conflicts. And this idea is fueled in large part by the profitability for governments, corporations, and a few individuals. And as feminists, we see a direct link also between militarism and patriarchy. And as you all know, patriarchy is an ideology that values what is typically considered masculine more over what is typically considered feminine. And so feminist scholars have demonstrated that descriptors such as strong, toughness, abstraction, rational, serious, tend to be associated with masculinity, while fear, emotional, weak, irrational tend to be associated with femininity. And so in this patriarchal framing, concern for human welfare, advocacy for human security, for disarmament, for solidarity, cooperation, for care for each other and the earth, etc., is feminized and almost belittled. And discourse that promotes security through weapons and violence is masculine and therefore considered valuable and desirable. And this kind of patriarchal attachment to weapons is a huge obstacle to overcoming the continued militarization that we're seeing all over the world. So why do I focus so much on militarism when this webinar or the topic is, climate change? It's because militarism is actually, the military-industrial complex is a huge contributor to the ecological crisis. And I just want to take a moment and explain why and how. So military activity, armed conflict, weapons development, testing, and use all have devastating impacts on the environment. And the first thing that's obviously the biggest contributor to climate change is fossil fuels. And the militaries all over the world are one of the largest users of fossil fuels. For example, the US military alone is one of the largest polluters in history. It emits more greenhouse gases annually than as many as 140 countries combined. And where do these emissions come from? They come from direct emissions due to operation of combat aircrafts and military vehicles. There's also residential emissions from military bases, and the US, of course, I think they have around 800 military bases all over the world, so it's massive. They come from naval operations, and they also are indirect military emissions that come from the supply chain of arms production and selling, amongst others. I think, most of you that are working on countries in the MENA region that are affected by conflict probably are already aware how armed conflict is having a direct impact on the environment. And, this is debris of explosive weapons, it's the destruction of infrastructure, it's the pollution of soil, air, and water, it's the targeted attacks on oil infrastructure that then pollutes the environment. It's deforestation, which again contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, which has an impact on wildlife. Simon mentioned, the use of water as a weapon of war. So there are a lot of direct impacts on the environment during armed conflict, but there's also a lot of environmental impacts in so-called times of peace. So when militaries and armed forces are preparing for war. And so firstly, the production, testing, and storage of conventional chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons create toxic and radioactive substances. And this contaminates, again, soil, air, and water. And especially the production of nuclear weapons has created a continual and protracted threat through the creation of nuclear waste. And then there's also military exercises. So militaries use large expanses of fragile land, marine resources, and airspace, which are bombed and polluted to prepare armed forces for war. And actually, military training areas cover 5 to 6% of the global land surface. So that's a huge amount of land that's only used for military exercises. These areas suffer from severe degradation. They destroy natural vegetation and disturb the wildlife habitat. And actually, the destruction that is caused by military exercises and weapons testing during peacetime exceeds that of wars themselves. And as I mentioned, among all of the military exercises and testing, the testing of nuclear weapons is really the most destructive ones. And it's very severe and enduring. And the impacts of nuclear weapons testing also has very racialized and gendered impacts. US and European nuclear weapons have mostly been tested on the territories of indigenous peoples. So there's this huge host of environmental impacts and climate impacts arising from military activity, both in conflict and in so-called peacetime. So we know that the military-industrial complex is terrible for the environment. And secondly, and that has been mentioned by Simone and also Sama, we see how the militaries are sucking out all these resources and all that money that we really need so much right now to address, pandemics and poverty and the climate crisis, address transition, like all of these really pressing issues that we're facing today. And in 2021, global military spending rose to $2 trillion, which is an amount that's, it's unimaginable. But it's been basically increasing for decades now, since the Cold War. And, they don't provide any solution to the biggest crisis that we're facing today. And just one example, we're also always being told from governments, oh yeah, we don't have the resources to deal with the climate crisis. We know the science, but we just don't have the resources. And then, for example, in Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau boasted on its climate commitments, but then his government spent $27 billion on the Department of National Defense while spending only $1.9 billion on the Department of Environment and Climate Change in 2020. So there's a huge mismatch of spending and priorities. And another aspect that I wanted to mention, which I think is important, is that the climate crisis has given militaries all around the world impetus to modernize and for governments to spend more money on militaries, because in conventional security narratives, the climate crisis is a threat that justifies and reinforces a militarized response to the climate crisis. So since the early 2000s, countries in the global north have integrated climate security in their defense planning, intelligence assessments, and military operational plans. And I think there's a whole set of risks that comes from the fact that militaries frame climate as a security issue, or like as a hard security issue, because the fundamental problem is that militaries and governments respond to a crisis caused by systemic injustice with security solutions that are hardwired in an ideology and institutions designed to seek control and continuity. And in focusing on responses to the impacts of climate change and the security interventions that might be required, they divert attention from the causes of the climate crisis, which are capitalism, colonialism, it's militarism. It's the very thing that they're trying to perpetuate. It's the power of corporations. It's economic policies such as free trade agreements. These are the actual issues. And by perpetuating this narrative that the militaries need to respond to the threat of climate change, they basically are just maintaining the status quo. And so, they need more money to militarize borders to keep refugees away, or they need more money to protect and move military bases due to rising sea levels due to climate change. So these are the kind of narratives and approaches that militaries are taking. And I think that's another worrying piece of the puzzle when it comes to the links between militarism and climate. So now I want to move to solutions and approaches to these challenges, or rather, like an entry point. And I've spoken a lot about militarism. So the opposite of militarism is demilitarization. It's disarmament and it's divestment. It's divestment of the resources that are spent on the military into all of the issues that we're facing right now. So at WILF, we're calling for, we have a vision of feminist peace, and that's an understanding that sees security not as predicated on patriarchal norms of weapons and militarism, but on societal well-being and care. And we seek to dismantle the systems of oppression, and to get there, we are calling for the centering of the voices of those that are disproportionately affected by both the ecological crisis and conflict. And that's something I think that we're all mentioned already. That's very crucial. So in the remaining, I think 5 minutes or so, I want to just focus on one particular approach, and that's disarmament. So WILF is calling for total and complete disarmament, divestment of military spending, and demilitarization. And this also means, importantly, that it's not enough for militaries to just go green. And we are seeing this trend more and more. So it is definitely an issue. There is the issue that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and the COPs are related to that. So that framework doesn't oblige states, signatories, to report on their military greenhouse gas emissions. So the reporting of military greenhouse gas emissions is only voluntary and therefore very patchy, and it's basically non-existent. So there's a huge lack of transparency and accountability. And while we do, call for the inclusion of military's greenhouse gas emissions into the general reporting obligations, we really we want to caution against implying that this is enough. So so first of all, once the militaries are reporting their emissions, and then once they have reduced their emissions, everything is fine. So we think we need to be careful not to fall into this trap. Because we don't think it's an answer for the US military to use solar panels or biodegradable bullets to power its death machinery, or for the British Army to explore alternative fuels, or for Spain to plant trees on military land to capture carbon. Because firstly, all of these this modernization will again require more public resources, and then militaries will say, oh, we need more money because we need to green our militaries. And secondly, in the same way that we have seen the military-industrial complex co-opt the women, peace, and security agenda, such as NATO, that is now priding itself on championing gender equality and diversity, whilst maintaining at the same time a patriarchal, militarized approach to the world. It's likely that the same actors will now co-opt, sincere calls and proposed solutions to the climate crisis, all to maintain the status quo. And so for all of the reasons outlined earlier, calling for disarmament and challenging patriarchy would make a huge contribution to not only protecting the planet, but also safeguarding millions of human lives. And by challenging militarized thinking, systems, and technologies at the local and global levels, we are working towards divestment, disarmament, and demilitarization efforts. And so at the international level, WILF is participating in many arms control and disarmament treaty meetings, where we continuously seek to hold governments to account and also elevate perspectives of those affected by conflict and weapons. And our messages at the multilateral level always center around demilitarization, complete disarmament, a reduction of military spending, but also calls for greater diversity and participation, because the UN multilateral space when it comes to disarmament is extremely male dominated, and it's in general very homogenous. And so we're bringing in people that have direct experiences of armed violence and conflict and seek to elevate their perspectives and voices. And we also are bringing in feminist perspectives to these disarmament fora. And feminist perspectives in disarmament is giving us key insights about gender norms that are imperative to understanding weapon proliferation and possession and use, and basically to help us understand why our world is so militarized. And we can take the example of nuclear weapons, which really is the pinnacle of patriarchal militarist mindset, of this idea that might makes right, and that the best way to be secure is to commit massive genocidal violence, and that weapons are the only way to make your country and government feel safe. And so feminist understandings allow us to understand and challenge these arguments, why nuclear weapons, they help us to understand why nuclear weapons have been around for so long, and also have been supported for so long. And they help us understand dynamics of oppression, dominance, etc. And they also help us to explore alternative ways of ensuring real collective human security, cooperation, and disarmament. And there is still strong resistance to this type of analysis in arms control spaces, but there was one process where feminist perspectives and practices really helped achieve a huge milestone, and that was the adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in 2017. And if people are interested, I can go more into detail later in the Q&A. I think I have like 50 seconds, no, I don't know, 50 seconds left or something. So I also just briefly wanted to mention what we're doing more at the local national levels when it comes to disarmament. So what partners and sections have been doing nationally, locally, is, for example, they have been doing advocacy to try and get their government to join a specific arms control treaty, or they have been doing awareness raising campaigns about the links between arms proliferation and gender norms. Another approach is research, data collection, because there's still such a lack of data when it comes to the impacts of weapons and armed conflict on the environment, or the gendered impacts and the human rights impacts of specific types of weapons. So really just kind of creating more data that we can use and then bring back to the multilateral level and use in our advocacy at the international level. So these are just a couple of points, and I think I'll leave it here. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Katrin, for sharing with us different linkages to the causes of the ecological crisis. And I'm going to use this terminology as well. And how it is, and you took us as well deeper into the understanding the causes of how militarization affect and impact ecological crisis. And you shared with us the causes, and it was like you shared as well very specific facts, such as that the US military emissions or impact on these crises are total or equal to 140 countries combined. That was an aha moment. And you also shared with us solutions by focusing at the disarmament program in a national and in a local level. Thank you so much for sharing. Now we're going to talk deeper with our next speaker, who's going to be Nidal Attallah. Nidal is the coordinator of the Environmental and Justice Program, as well as the coordinator of the communication and visibility at the Heinrich-Böll Foundation in Palestine and Jordan since 2018. He holds master's degrees in engineering geology from Kent State University, Ohio, and a bachelor degree in geosciences, minoring in chemistry and politics from Earlham College, Indiana, USA. Nidal currently works closely with several environmental and human rights organizations and activists in Palestine and in Jordan, and has co-organized many events and activities on environmental and climate justice. He has also contributed to and coordinated the production of several environmental publications, the latest of which are the Plastic Altus MENA Region Edition and Conscious Choices, a guide to ethical shopping in Palestine. Nidal will shed the light on the challenges faced by women in Palestine, particularly in southern Hebron, who are vulnerable to climate change, which is compounded by the Israeli occupation and its policies, and how these policies are limiting the community's ability to adapt to climate change. And Nidal, very happy to have you with us today, and the mic is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Samah, and it's my pleasure to be joining your great series of webinars, and I really enjoyed our previous speakers, and I hope I can shed a little bit light about this topic from something more related to the context of Palestine, something that we work with several partners on researching a little bit more and showing the parallels between gender issues and climate change and conflict, as is the topic of the webinar. As you mentioned, I will focus more on Area C of the West Bank and Masafa Yatta in southern Hebron, in the West Bank, Palestine, and occupied Palestinian territory, and give you just a general overview about the situation and try to kind of find these connections to how this is impacting women. And also, I mean, I have to say that this is not just to show how women are only perceived in this vulnerability lens. They are the ones to carry the brunt of the burden in these specific communities and this area. But as my previous speakers mentioned, it's always important to emphasize that they do have agency and that women should be part of more policy making and processes for conflict resolution and other aspects tackling the climate breakdown. I like to call it the climate breakdown, not climate change. And I'll add now to my dictionary ecological crisis as well. Okay, so just to go into it, as some of you that know about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the Israeli occupation has been practicing since 1967 complete domination over and let's say over exploitation as well of Palestinian natural resources in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And it has been doing that for its own benefit, for the benefit of the state and for the benefit of its settlers and citizens in Israel proper. And this is done with impunity, as some of you may be aware. This is the resources that I'm referring to are water, stone, agricultural lands, minerals from the Dead Sea, and even now, most recently, that has come to the spotlight, fossil fuels. This is these mounting violations are causing a protracted crisis. This prolonged occupation is causing environmental injustice, and I'll get to mention a few examples of how this is being done. To focus on Area C of the West Bank, which makes up over 60% of the West Bank. This is the designation that was given during the peace accords. This area is completely under Israeli control, under the occupation's control, both administrative and military. So there is no jurisdiction for the Palestinian Authority in this area. And in fact, in recent years, we've been seeing how through discriminatory planning and zoning practices, the occupation has prevented Palestinians from the right to movement in this area, number one, and also to access resources and their means to livelihood. in these areas, especially in South Hebron, these communities have depended for decades on agriculture, on herding, etc. So they absolutely need these resources to survive. And now we've added a multiplier that they have to cope with climate change. Even though, you know, I think we should all refuse that. That the occupation is a pre-existing vulnerability. It is, unfortunately, but it shouldn't be accepted as the norm, I think. But climate change, or the effects of the climate breakdown, is compounding and exacerbating existing vulnerabilities due to the geopolitical landscape and due to the occupation's policies and practices. In recent years, the occupation has started, well, not in recent years, for many years now, has been using different pretexts and land designations, such as a military zone, a firing zone, or a military buffer zone, oftentimes even using natural reserves, taking land, confiscating land in the name of natural reserves. So we can see, and this is nearly 20% of the Jordan Valley, which has been announced to be annexed by Israel. So we can see a form of greenwashing, but also as well a form of acquiring land, taking land from its indigenous population. In the Jordan Valley, the occupation carries out measures to effectively annex Palestinian lands and to forcibly transfer its population. In recent days and months, I could say the issue of Masafer Yatta came to the spotlight in the news, whereby over 1,200 Palestinians are threatened of forcible transfer from their land, their ancestral land. And this is being done systematically, especially in the Jordan Valley and in Area C, where communities that are prevented from any form of development. We have daily cases of bulldozers and military jeeps confiscating water and sanitation equipment, bulldozers destroying bathrooms or any form of a structure, pipelines. They don't want the water to get to these populations, even though they are large agricultural communities. And so they're creating these cohesive environments whereby you cannot persist, even though these communities are extremely resilient after decades of occupation and military attacks and brutalization by an occupying power. It's becoming more and more dire, because not only do they have to cope with a changing climate, with heat waves, with intermittent rainfall, with changing natural phenomena. And one of the researchers that one of our partners did, they noticed, people started noticing, they're saying, yes, there's something different about how water is being, how precipitation is occurring, and how they're unable to store even water in cisterns, and simple methods that they typically used, and the simplest adaptation measures that you would imagine them to do, to carry out, to sustain their livelihood in these areas. So in the meantime, while all of this is happening to all these communities in Area C, of course, illegal Israeli settlements are thriving. The settlement enterprise is continuously expanding. It is actually sustaining its existence and expansion on Palestinian natural resources that are available underground and above ground. And it's also, as you've seen recently, benefiting many multinational corporations that are functioning in the settlements, as well as Israeli businesses that are selling products to Europe and across the world. So this is also a grave violation of international law. And I think if we look at only the stone industry in the West Bank, it's rich in limestone and other forms of stone. This is sustaining and benefiting the occupation and its corporations and companies to a large extent. So these policies and de facto measures are denying Palestinians their fundamental rights. They're creating these coercive environments and preventing them from adapting to climate change, and also, as I said, threatening their mere existence. The aim seems to be displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian population. Now, the Jordan Valley, in the 2011 climate change adaptation strategy of Palestine, The Palestinian Authority identified Masafir Yatta in southern Hebron, as well as the Jordan Valley, the eastern parts of the Jordan Valley, and the Gaza Strip as the most climatically vulnerable areas in Palestine. And these areas happen to be the areas that are suffering the most from this, these military attacks, these policies and practices. Israel's prolonged occupation, I think, is hindering Palestinians' ability to develop and implement adequate adaptation strategy, as is being written on paper in the strategies of the Palestinian Authority. And they're not being able to positively cope with the climate breakdown. For instance, when you are deprived from access of water, land, other resources, you cannot even implement the simplest adaptation measures like water harvesting, rainwater harvesting, or soil erosion, or other forms that these communities may have been able to implement. And also, there are examples of how this zoning and military domination is putting these communities in smaller and smaller areas. Aside from them, their communities being destroyed and their structures being destroyed very often, is that, for instance, with herding, they cannot use the typical herding grounds that they did, and so they have to use a limited area of land, which is exhausting the environment, and they have less and less water, so it's kind of exacerbating this climate breakdown. And this applies to food production, them having to buy fodder and other livestock feeds at elevated prices. They're having to buy tankered water in trucks at also very high and elevated prices. So, okay, how does this affect women? We've given the context. I mean, in general, studies have suggested that women and girls are more vulnerable to climatic changes and related hazards. They often face higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of the climate breakdown, especially when in situations of poverty. And we know that the majority of the world's population, the majority of the poor of the world are women, in fact. So they are more strongly impacted by the adverse effects, and in terms of also they're affected by water shortages and resource exhaustion. In Palestine, it's no different. I think it's even more blatant. Women carry the brunt of the burdens resulting from climate change and occupations policies. It's exacerbating existing vulnerabilities. Also, if we look at the structure of how, I think also worldwide, not just specific to Palestine, even though many of these communities are conservative, Palestinian women are the primary caretakers, and they are the managers at the household level. They are primarily responsible for resource management, securing water, food, taking care of hygiene of the family. They're the care providers, even for the disabled. Yes,
Nida, yeah, yes, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but you speak just slower, so our interpreter
is
sure to keep up with you.
My bad, my bad. Yes, sure. Sorry for the Arabics, the people receiving interpretation. Yes. So, as I mentioned, they are responsible even when family members are getting sick. The elderly, the disabled, women are the ones that are the caretakers. In a study that we did with our partners, Women, Media and Development, they studied the area of Idna in Hebron, and the study focused on the burning of electronic waste that's being transferred from Israel to the West Bank. And it showed how women that are taking up this responsibility are, first of all, more exposed to the fumes of the electronic waste burning. Second of all, they're the ones that are paying the consequence of when the family members get sick and having to take care of them. And also, and this is shows, I think, also the patriarchal structures that are existing, is that they are under societal pressure, where you have people, when they fight against this phenomenon, that, you know, people come to their brothers and fathers and husbands and saying, you know, look at your women, they're on Facebook, you know, they're speaking about this phenomenon. But I have to say that the women activists, the female activists that we got to meet are extremely resilient and showed how they are also at the forefront of popular resistance, whether be it to the occupation or to this kind of phenomena, which is also related to occupation's policies in systematically transferring hazardous waste to the West Bank, including nuclear waste, by the way, which is, when we talk about the nuclear file, we always neglect, except for this one country that has a nuclear program. To talk about the legal aspects, I do not have much time. I wanted to cover a little bit. I mean, if we talk about international, in IHL, we can talk about the Hague regulations, the Fourth Geneva Convention as an occupying power, how Israel doesn't have the right to use these resources for its own benefit, but only to for administrative reasons. Also, when we look at the different conventions, you mentioned Human Rights Committee also gives the right to self-determination. You guys mentioned the Security Council 1325, of course, where all parties of armed conflict have to protect women and girls from gender-based violence and other forms of violence as well. CEDAW is also, I think, relevant, where we have violations of of the UN Committee for Elimination of Discrimination against women. And also, I have to just mention of this body of international law that is applicable in the case of the occupied Palestinian territory. If we look at environmental law, I think it's still in development, but if we look at the Paris Agreement, which is actually Israel and Palestine are signatories on, it is the responsibility of state parties to reduce climate change vulnerability and strengthen resilience to the impact of climate change. But if we look at Israel's nationally determined contributions, there's a dismissal of the fact that there is an indigenous population or a Palestinian vulnerable population due to their own policies. So they are doing the complete opposite in that regard. And I think I'll conclude with this. I think with the crisis, the world crisis that is being faced now with Russia and Ukraine, we're seeing that with the search for new resources, fossil fuel resources, there's been complicity of going to the occupation and getting stolen Palestinian gas resources from the occupation to Europe, whereby we are being complicit with violations of international law. And this is not acceptable, even if we refuse a different occupation. So thank you so much, and I'm sorry for taking more time than I should have.
Not at all. Thank you so much, Nidal, for expanding our dictionary when we define the word climate crisis by adding into it climate breakdown. It was very interesting to hear different challenges that the Palestinians in general are facing in Palestine from the Israeli occupation, and in particularly for women. And it was very interesting to hear how Palestinians agencies already awaken and they're already aware of the circumstances that they're living in their daily life, and they're living it actually at the moment, and how the Israeli occupation is limiting the Palestinians' right to be able to cope up with the climate crisis. Thank you so much for sharing. And I want to invite everyone to share with us their questions and answers in the question and answer option to Nidal, and to share with us their thoughts as well in the chat. Now it's time for us to go to our next speaker. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Vanessa Farr. Vanessa is a feminist peace activist who works on the intersectional gendered impacts of the militarization and climate disruption. She holds a PhD from the School of Women's Studies at York University, Toronto, Canada, is a long-standing member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and has published 2 books and several academia articles and chapters on gender and crisis. Vanessa will introduce to us entry points for integrated actions to respond to the gender discrimination of climate security risks, to minimize the threats to peace and maximize opportunities for women to build and sustain peace. So honored to have you with us today, Vanessa, and the mic is yours.
Shukran, Ahleen. It's lovely to be with all of you. Even though what we're talking about is so difficult and so sad. I don't know how many people in the Arab states know that there is now a whole slew of psychological language in English that describes the feelings we have when we talk about climate. Eco-anxiety and eco-depression and all kinds of other terms. But I'm going to suggest to you today, from my position here in Cape Town on occupied indigenous land, where I am a settler, I'm an inheritor of settlers. I am a third generation settler on my mother's side, and I have all of the privileges of whiteness and all of the privileges of my colonial ancestry standing behind me as I speak to you today. I'm going to suggest to you that what's happening in the English language, since we're working in translation today, is that finally white people, colonialists, are beginning to understand just how deep the Nakba is. We are all, the poet Natalie Diaz, who is an indigenous poet from what's now known as North America, what's really called Turtle Island. She says we are living in a long Nakba. The Nakba has been going on for at least 500 years for indigenous populations. And the reason that we are talking about climate change today is because even white people are scared of what they have been doing. Now, even white people are scared. And so all of you who have suffered centuries of this oppression, you in the Arab states, we were introduced by Samah as saying, we don't really have this language in the Middle East and North Africa, whatever the Middle East is. In West Asia and North Africa, we don't even have this language. We're behind everybody else on climate change. But that's not true. I'm going to say that to you right now. You know more about this than most people do. What are the things that you know about? You know about the loss of land. You know about the destruction of soils. You know about toxins. You know about having your water taken away from you. You know about the birth defects that happen when women are exposed to military weapons. You know about the fact that even when a baby is safely inside his or her mother, the military toxins, the polyfluoral carbons, can I remember their name, PFCs, are crossing the barrier from the placenta into the baby. Infants and non-human infants, the babies of cows, the babies of chickens, everybody is affected by the toxins of war. And you know about this. You know about what Rob Nixon calls the slow violence of coloniality. You know about the fact that your seed varieties are gone. You know that you can't predict when to plant, and you don't know when to harvest. You know that the plants that you are being supplied with by agricultural extension workers are genetically modified and that they won't grow again next year. And you know that all of your seed saving and all of your food practices that your mothers and your grandmothers passed down to you are being destroyed. You know about language. You know about the stories that we tell about land. You know about how when we love the land that we live on, we know where to plant. We know where to put the waterways. We know how to give back to the land. You know about the relationships that are possible between humans and non-humans. I think Katrine is right when she says we need to talk not about climate crisis, but about ecological crisis. And the Greek origin of the word ecology, ekos, means home. So ecological crisis talks to us about a situation in which we are not able to live in our home anymore, because all of our relationships have been undermined and destroyed. And especially those relationships are not possible when military equipment is included in the mix of horror that coloniality already brought to us. Think about what happens to a piece of land. Think about what happens to wind and soil and water when an enormous concrete barricade is built from one place to another place in the name of security, in the name of protecting, for instance, from the Nakba in Palestine, protecting the Israelis from these dangerous indigenous people. But every one of you living in West Asia, living in North Africa, encounters every single day these incredible boundaries that were invented in the middle part of the last century to block the movement of people. Those do not only block the movement of people, they block the movement and the changes of the world. And many of those borders, because the European colonial imperialist powers saw fit to create borders that are natural barricades like rivers, those borders are changing. Those borders are shifting. Those borders are changing direction. And that is a lesson to us about the fact that even though we have created these political barricades, we white people, my ancestors, the Europeans who colonized the world, have created these impossible barricades to your living. That doesn't mean that we can't change, because the world is changing all the time. I was asked to speak today about the possible entry points into the international system of methods and ideas and possibilities that we can use to push back against this horrific violence that we're facing. But first, before I do that, I want to tell you a story that I find very interesting about the United Nations. When it was founded in 1945 on the absolute trash heap that Europe had made of its own continent, at the end of the Second European War, which they turned into a world war by bringing everybody else into it and killing as many people as they could. A group of men met in America, in the United States of America, the victor of the Second World War, the ally that had rescued everybody else. And they had their very first meeting to discuss the founding of a United Nations, getting rid of the League of Nations. Let's go, let's have the United Nations, let's make everything better. And they met in a plantation house. They met in a property where enslaved African bodies had been tortured for profit, for capitalist profit, for centuries beforehand. They didn't meet unopposed by African Americans. Among other people, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a very wonderful and brilliant philosopher of racism, he had a counter meeting. He held a meeting where he called people together from the colonies, and he said, how do we speak into this thing that they're forming, that they're calling the United Nations? How do we challenge it? What do we say that will make them stop? Because he read the documents that were being prepared for this brilliant, wonderful new site of human rights. And he said they are dangerous and they are wrong and they're going to lead us to more violence. And then his words disappeared without a trace. Except they didn't disappear without a trace, did they? Because we're speaking about them today. The Security Council was formed as the top body of this new United Nations, and it had 5 permanent members. The word permanence, I hope you're already noticing, is not an ecological word, because ecology is about change. It's about movement. It's about shifting. It's about things disappearing and going away because they're not relevant and they're not important and they don't help us. But in their hubris, the 5 powers said, we are the permanent members. And the very first thing they did, having made themselves the permanent members, was they started to build borders around their colonial entities that they wanted to control. So they built Palestine, the Nakba, 1948. They created the border between India and Pakistan. How many of you have heard of the disaster that's called partition? But how many of you thought about the fact that when Pakistan got its southernmost border, the border with India, it also got its northernmost border, and that is the border with Afghanistan. And Afghanistan's northernmost border was set there by Stalin as part of the Russian Empire, declaring its endless power. Coloniality has done nothing for the last 100 years but hide behind the instruments of the United Nations. And where does that leave us as feminists? Where does that leave us as people trying to find a way into the system that's supposed to deliver to us? Well, that too is a long and complicated and interesting story. What happened as the United Nations was writing its charter was that there were a couple of women, white women. There were no black women involved. There were no Arab women involved. There was one Syrian, actually, I lied. There was one Syrian woman. They wrote a new language. They said, no, you can't use the language of humankind. You will talk about people. We will talk about everyone. They changed the charter. It was going to take a number of years before that started to have meaning, but there that language was, it was shifted. And then women immediately said, this new human rights regime that you're pretending to have brought into the world doesn't work, doesn't include women. They were white women, but they did think about women. And they wrote DDAO, and then they wrote CEDAW. And then women said, this Security Council doesn't reflect our lives. And then we wrote 1325, Security Council 1325. The first time in the history of the United Nations that a Security Council resolution actually pays attention to women. So what is all of this telling us about this helplessness that we feel? It is saying to us that we are not helpless, and it is saying to me that you know what to do. You know what you are doing. You know what you are facing. You have faced a century and more of coloniality, and you know what to do to oppose it. So the first thing I encourage everyone to do now is, please go and familiarize yourself. It's available in Arabic. This is one thing the UN is good for, right? It translates all the documents. I want you to please go and read resolution of CEDAW's General Recommendation 37, written in 2018, which is probably the best document that we've got in Arabic to give you a language to speak about what it is that you need to say. Don't feel that you haven't got the language. It's a very thorough document. It like all CEDAW recommendations, it talks about women's equality in the law. It talks about access to justice. It talks about how states parties can be supported to report on the climate and military destruction that they're facing. It links all the different bodies of the United Nations, which, as you know, do not like to talk to one another. Sorry about the dogs in the background. They're just moving through. It talks about the differences to be faced when there's an extreme sudden onset violence. For instance, because waters are rising and the land is being built over and there's nowhere for that water to sink. And that creates these terrible floods that we're seeing. But it also talks about the slow violences that we experience when military toxins build in the soils. It talks about the problem that women are so often excluded from official science. Science is a very important tool of coloniality. And CEDAW recognizes this, that there are certain kinds of science that are being done that women are not part of, that the experiences that women are making as they see the seasons change, as they watch the waters change, as they look at what happens when polluted toxic waters are put onto damaged soil. It talks about all of that. It gives us a language. It talks about biohazards, including nuclear weapon systems. And it also talks about economic aggression as one of the accelerators of ecocide and genocide and coloniality. So it's an important entry point. And what I would like to encourage you to do when you read it is think about the words it's using. Do they work for you in Arabic? Do they really communicate what it is that you feel you have to be able to talk about in your climate activism? Are there better words? Are there better stories? These are just translations of ideas. Those ideas are present in your minds. They're present in your daily conversations. That language is your language. Find your way to it. The other thing you can look at that's really helpful is the 2014 Lima work program on gender, which is specifically and directly focuses on climate crisis, eco-crisis, and the ways in which the different protocols of the UN can be brought together. You can also look at the Paris Agreement, although now, having been written in 2015, yes, Nidal is shaking his head. It's not as powerful as it could be. There's a financing for development mechanism. There's a very interesting OECD study from 2021 on gender and environment that will help you to position your work in the SDGs in more effective ways. And I recommend you have a look at that. I don't think it's available in Arabic, but maybe it's something that can be translated. And then, of course, there are the SDGs themselves, which are that puzzling group of ideas that were put together. The SDGs also have a history. The Millennium Development Goals had nothing in them about the environment. They didn't talk about climate. They didn't talk about war, and they couldn't be delivered, right? So when the SDGs were written by a group of dissenters inside the UN, because sometimes people can get together and they can dissent even inside the UN system, the SDGs have got these interesting ways of hooking themselves into one another. So one of the things I would recommend you do, don't stick to SDG 5. I know that's a common practice, but don't do it. The SDGs, I would say, if I was using them now, I would look at sustainable agriculture, SDG 2. What is sustainable agriculture? It's agriculture the way it has always been practiced. Where was the first agriculture? Where did it come from? It came from you. It came from the area that's now called Iraq. It came from you. So you know about sustainable agriculture. What did the old people know about taking care of the earth? How do you translate that into SDG 2? What did the old people know about water? You come from the part of the world that is the most famous for managing water and has been since the beginning of time. SDG 5. I'm being told to shut up now. SDG 7 on energy. SDG 9 on innovation and infrastructure. 11 on sustainable cities and communities. Do you know that the first time Europeans encountered Tripoli, when they crossed the Mediterranean in the Middle Ages, in what we call the Middle Ages, they found the most beautiful, organized, wonderful city What is it that you already know about how cities need to be run? You know a lot. Go back to your archaeology. Sustainable consumption and production. The first thing, I hope all of you are boycotting and never eat at McDonald's and wouldn't drink a Starbucks coffee if somebody paid you. Don't engage on a personal level. Don't engage with global corporate food systems. Just disengage from them. Take your money somewhere else. Go down to your local coffee cellar and drink a lovely ahwe with cardamom and ignore these impositions. Climate action is what you do every single day when you get up and you think about what you're going to do with your body and the water that you consume that day. That's SDG 13. SDG 14, those of you who live near an ocean, that's about where is your plastic going? 1 minute. And finally, SDG 15, which talks to us about ecosystems. This is about your relationships, our relationships between ourselves and the more than human world. And all of this is available to us. I know we feel frightened, and I know we feel discouraged, but we have also built this reporting system. We have also built this way to make our voices heard. And the more that we can use that language, the more that we can become familiar with our own beautiful ideas, the more we will be resisting. Coloniality is climate crisis. Coloniality is pollution. And the only way for us to make it stop is to keep doing our anti-colonial work. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I really enjoyed your sharing with us your wisdom. You were able to awaken our own agency by making me reflect personally on what are the things that are affecting me directly and how I deal with it. But you also, at the same time, balanced that by showing me hope and telling me that things would shift, and made me think about how life shifting around us and how can we impact positively. And you ended up by sharing with us a lot of great resources for us to know more about the challenges, the terminology, and how can we express ourselves into that. Very thankful for having you with us today. Thank you. And I want to invite as well our speakers to share with us their answers to the questions that the audience have shared with us before in the question and answer option. So please feel free to respond to our participants there. I want to thank our great speakers, Vanessa, Katrin, Simone, and Nidal, for being with us today and for sharing their wisdom with us. And I want to thank as well our participants, and I want to encourage them to follow us in our Twitter account, Kvinna Mina, and share with us their thoughts, reflections, takeaways, and questions in our Twitter account. And I want to as well announce that in our next webinar, we will focus on climate change and how it intersects with gender-based violence and health rights. So thank you so much for being with us, and we see you all next week. Thank you, everyone.
Shukran. Have you got some answers for questions? I've been trying to put links for people.
I saw that you've been doing that. That was great. Thank you so much. And as well, Vanessa, you shared with us a lot of readings and articles. If you have any links for them or recommendations, would you like to write them in the chat? So just like take it with us. Yeah,
I'll try and do that. The general recommendation that I mentioned is number 37 from 2018. Okay. You'll have to Google it to find the Arabic translation. It's really good. It's really thorough. It connects things in a very helpful way.
I believe that.
Yeah.
And I saw that you wrote it as well in the chat. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, everyone. And we see you all next week. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Nidal.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Melissa. Bye.